Okay, my name is Jenny Paterno-Shin. I work for Rutgers University, based out of the Haskins Shellfish Research Laboratory, which is a field station, a part of the New Jersey Ag Experimental Station. So we do various applied fisheries research, also coastal processes and dynamic research, things like that. But I'm here today to present on living shorelines and how they might be a potential method to reduce some of this saltwater flooding in coastal farms. So just some current news articles. This is not just a mid-Atlantic trend. It's happening all along the East Coast and into the Gulf, even on the West Coast. And internationally, that saltwater is covering farmland and not being very amiable to crops. So we've discussed already today, but just to review, the Atlantic, in addition to sea level rise, is also facing subsidence. So that compounds these issues even further for water intrusion and erosion along the coast. Focusing in on New Jersey a little bit, which is where I'm most familiar, Garden State obviously, so we have a lot of farmland. And then zooming in even closer to the Delaware Bay shore region, which is where most of our work is conducted. Here's the Delaware Bay. If you're not familiar, I didn't realize people were from all over the country, really. So Delaware Bay's here, fed primarily by the Delaware River. This little subsection here along the bay shore, excluding the Delaware Bay itself, has almost equal percentages of land covered by water, tidally and not tidally, as it does by agricultural land. So it's pretty significant in this region to be a spot for these impacts. This is a photo leading to one of our Rutgers laboratories, and this is regular saltwater flooding across the road. You can see what once was a forest is now a ghost forest, and then not even a quarter mile down the road is a farm field. I don't know the farmer personally to know what he's growing, but after attending this conference, I'm even more curious now as to what he's up to and growing. So in addition to the things that Chris talked about with salt-tolerant plants, I'm going to focus a little bit on the Shoreline Edge specifically. So some conventional techniques that are used to prevent water from coming into properties might be bulkheads or seawalls. And obviously you get the erosion control benefits, but you lack some of these habitat or coastal processes benefits. The coast is meant to be dynamic and moving to combat changes in conditions, but the seawalls and bulkheads are very static. So what is a, quote, living shoreline? So the term living shoreline has been around for quite a while, 10, 15 plus years, but has recently been popularized in media and with different projects. So it has a wide range of meanings of what some people call a living shoreline. But essentially these principles are: it incorporates natural features into the design to reduce erosion and create habitat. Two complementary goals being to stem erosion that's leading to marsh loss and help with that buffer, to allow the marsh to keep pace with sea level rise, because marshes are meant to accrete sediment and keep pace with changing conditions. But as sea level rise increases at a rate faster than the marsh can compensate to, that's when we get a lot of these coastal flooding issues. And a living shoreline also integrates ecological principles into the engineering. So instead of just having an engineer design a structure that's meant to stop water or break waves, there's some thought into what habitat would this provide to the local shellfish, for example, or plant life. This is a graphic from NOAA here about how living shorelines support resilient communities. And just to point out most notably for here is that option for living shorelines to improve water quality, create habitat and biodiversity, trap sediments, allowing the marsh to grow as sea level rises. This is an image from the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary that's sort of a traditional living shoreline design, basically. So you have an eroding marsh edge. This is a saltwater environment, by the way. These living shorelines can be done in freshwater habitats as well. You have an eroding marsh edge here. So you might add these structures that are made out of coconut fiber or core. So it's biodegradable natural material. They're stuffed into 15-foot-long logs that are placed along the marsh edge. You might use other structures like shell bags here. This is recycled shell placed into bags to help stabilize the logs. And the idea is that as the logs slow down energy, the sediment that's in the water will drop out. And in the Delaware estuary, it's a very sediment-rich environment, so that's not a slow point for us there, accreting sediment. So this sediment will fill in behind the logs, and then slowly you can plant native grasses, usually Spartina alterniflora, and then you'll get some shellfish recruitment, hopefully, of ribbed mussels, which help stabilize the roots of the marsh grasses and the structures, and possibly some oysters as well, depending on where exactly this is located. This is the poster child, you could say, for that basic design that I just showed you. This is an installation in the Morris River in New Jersey at a place called Matt's Landing. This is a marina with a crab shedding operation, so more aquaculture than agriculture for this example. They had riprap placed along the shoreline because it was eroding so badly. And we installed a living shoreline here. These are the coconut fiber logs that were installed first. You can see all backfilled behind it with mud and silt. The Spartina was planted as plugs or seedlings, and also from salvage material that had slumped off of the marsh, planted there. And then a year or two later, as it's at the right elevation, the Spartina took off, and you can hardly tell that there's anything there now. And this was installed in 2010. This is a very low energy site. It's in a river near a no wake zone, so we're not getting, crashing coastal front energy waves here. So that's on the spectrum here of living shorelines in this edging technique. So basically you can think of it as going from green, soft techniques all the way to gray and hard techniques. And this is where I said the living shoreline term is thought of by different people in a different way. So some people think that living shoreline should be vegetation only, very natural, low substrate added or low materials added to the marsh, all the way up to something that includes breakwater structures that are made out of rock or concrete or shells. So there's a spectrum of living shoreline installations here. And here's that example with an off-water breakwater. This would be for a higher energy site. And so the wave rolls in, hits the breakwater structure. Energy is reduced as it comes into the shoreline, and that allows sediment to fall out behind it. You can then begin to plant your native plants or whatever else is part of your engineering and design. This is an example of one of our active projects along the Delaware Bay on the small town of Gandy's Beach. These are called Oyster Castles, and they're basically fancy concrete blocks that are meant to be stacked and built together into different configurations. This is when they were first installed in 2016. Then shortly after, here's the sand sort of slumping behind them as the energy is reduced. And a year to two later, we have large communities of oysters that are inhabiting the breakwaters, and there's current monitoring going on with our partners from the Nature Conservancy in partnership with the Delaware Estuary to look at the topography, how things are actually changing, and what the impact of the breakwater structures are. Some other examples from along the coast, everything from a rock sill, rocks along the edge, low relief, all the way to reef balls, higher relief, and this example here, which are shells in plastic bags held up by rebar in this maybe like a herringbone type pattern. So many different configurations. Again, some of these goals are different. It might be for oyster restoration, and through oyster restoration efforts, this idea of a living shoreline can be achieved as opposed to maybe not farmland or preventing flooding on a field is the goal. So some steps to create a living shoreline. A site analysis would need to be done. Would one work here? What would need to be constructed or added? What's the energy like, the fetch, wave attenuation? How would that work at the site? Permitting and application. I'll admit I have not worked on permitting for any of the projects that I've worked on, so I can't comment on the challenges associated with permitting. However, I do know that it can be somewhat arduous, but is very important.
It's gotten better.
Preparation. Perhaps there's riprap or dock pieces or things that need to be removed from the site before the living shoreline can be installed. During the installation process, it may be one phase, one day with a team of people, or it may be multi-phase where you're putting some structures in, and then next phase would be planting during optimal growing season. And lastly, monitoring and maintenance. So you'd want to know, is this working? Is it helping me? So again, topography monitoring would be good to do if shellfish are of interest, shellfish monitoring, and maintenance. So you can't just set it and forget it. Just like any other tactic, it is going to require some maintenance and care. This is us this summer maintaining that Matt's Landing living shoreline. So it's now in its 7th year being at the site, and it has required some updating, needing new materials. If a corner has slumped down, it might need another log, or if the vegetation is dying because it's dropped below that optimal growing range, we need to build up the elevation a little bit. But you can see, you can hardly tell, besides the shell bags here along the bottom, that there's really anything installed under there. Looking at costs, living shorelines do tend to cost less than some of these harder structures that are on the grayer end of that living shoreline spectrum. And maintenance, you're looking at less than $100 per linear foot for some of these simpler natural designs, and up to $500 per linear foot for some of the grayer designs. I mentioned monitoring and evaluation. So some metrics again would be marsh elevation, sediment accretion, plant growth and survival, wave attenuation, which can be done with pressure sensors. And again, these things are costly, and it depends on what the focus of your living shoreline project is. And like I said, shellfish recruitment, if that's of interest, which does help slow down energy with all the surface area of oysters and mussels growing. And do they work? So researchers are actively exploring this question. Do living shorelines work? Where do they work the best? What type of site conditions fit each of those different designs? And the design possibilities are endless, and they're very site specific. But in combination here, we have a paper from Manus 2014 showing that Spartina alterniflora and the eastern oyster were effective living shoreline treatments in reducing wave energy. Living shorelines can reduce erosion. These soft stabilization techniques can work. And they can also accrete sediment almost 2 times greater than adjacent marshes. So they really help that process. With that being said, I want to note that living shorelines are not a cure-all for everywhere. Depends on the scope or the extent of the flooding and erosional issues. It may not be an appropriate solution if you have a 10-mile stretch of shoreline that is flooding your farm. It may be something beyond, a little bit beyond the scope of a simpler living shorelines projects. However, the principles of living shorelines may be applicable, but it's very site specific onto whether which designs will work. So as far as implementation goes, you'd want to contact your local, state, or governing agency for more information on required permitting. I have some information that's New Jersey specific I can share if anyone's interested, but as far as other states, I don't have contact information for those agencies. And just currently a little plug for our partners, the Nature Conservancy. They currently have a research funding proposal out that's looking to help people either get permitting requirements completed or implement a living shoreline project, and that's current. So there's I think $5,000 to $35,000 available per project to help support getting more of these off the ground. And that's all I have. Thanks. Yes?
You mentioned monitoring. Do you have any pre and post monitoring for the implementation of some of these practices you've discussed that you could share some from New York State who are working on trying to come up with monitoring criteria statewide?
Yeah, definitely. There are some resources online also. I'll get your contact information. I can send there some metrics and monitoring frameworks that have been developed as part of the New Jersey and Delaware Living Shorelines committees that are out there, and also the Nature Conservancy has a published guide on that. But as far as the Gandy's Beach project, but the Oyster Castles, I just saw some of the current monitoring on that as far as the elevation changes goes. It's showing that in certain areas there is sediment accretion. In certain areas there's also sediment loss. So it's learning a little bit more about what orientation perhaps the structures need to be at to provide the best wave attenuation and sediment accretion. The Matt's Landing site with the coconut logs, work there has really shown that the site is effective in that project. The marsh elevation has been raised, and it's been fairly stable with some augmentation with storms and icing. But with that, there were 2 other living shorelines installations just upriver from that site that were, quote, failures. They didn't look like, the poster child of the living shoreline. And we still return to those sites and look at how they've changed. And what we've seen actually is even though they look like a failure, a couple of them have had slower rates of shoreline loss than adjacent areas. So the part of the living shoreline that remained seems to be doing something, although not as drastic as those results that I showed.